Exploration. The search for the unknown has shaped the history of our species, molding our behavior in ways we are only beginning to understand. And that understanding is about to come into focus for us today, thanks to today's guest, best-selling author, and one of my favorite writers, Dr. Alex Hutchinson. Alex is well known both for his popular Outside magazine columns on the topic of sweat science and his exceptional book, Endure: Mind, Body, and the Curiously Elastic Limits of Human Performance. His book influenced the direction I took with my own PhD work. He first joined us way back in 2019, one of our first 20 episodes ever recorded, which is now over 350 episodes. He brings a fascinating background as an elite runner, a PhD in physics, and is basically who I want to be when I grow up, except he's a decade younger than I am. You're going to love this discussion. So many insights covering our draw towards this exploration and what it means for high performance and for life. I got the opportunity to read an early release of this new book, The Explorer's Gene, and it is exceptional. I have underlined and scribbled all over it, which is a good sign. We'll have a link to that book in the show notes. If this is your first time joining us, I'm your host, Dr. Brad Cooper of Catalyst Coaching, and it is amazing to think this is our 7th year of the podcast, a little project that originally began as an effort to bring evidence-based practices to the world of health, wellness, and performance, a world often dominated by snake oil and exaggerated claims. Thank you for making the Coaching Lab a part of your week. If you're looking to earn your MBHWC approved coach certification, the Catalyst Coaching Institute was named the #1 program in the nation by Fortune magazine and the most customizable by Forbes. And the personal touch, most of our programs involve less than 20 students, gives you the individual attention you need to be successful regardless of where you're taking it. Registration for the next cohort launch is available now at catalystcoachinginstitute.com, or please reach out anytime. Results at Catalyst Coaching Institute, and we'll set up some time to get on the phone, answer any questions you've got, and help you decide if this is the right choice. And now, it's time to do a little exploring about exploring on the latest episode of the Coaching Lab podcast. How do you know when it's time for a new book? I loved Endure, one of my all-time favorites. It had a big impact on kind of the direction we took when I was going through my PhD stuff. This is a not completely, but it's a big left turn. And you talk about that in the book and why you were drawn to that versus a continuation of the best-selling Endure. So how do you know? What's that sense? Where does that come from?
Yeah, so this answer may take an hour. So
that's all right. We got all the time you want.
Yeah. So to the first question is, how do you know when it's time for a new book? The time for a new book was 6 years ago, according to my agent and all the good advice. It's been 7 years since Endure came out, and that's not. I remember having this conversation with David Epstein after Sports Gene came out, and his agent was like, relax, dude, just, take your time, just whatever you do, don't be stupid. And don't let it be 5 years till your next book comes out. And then his next book came out 6 years ago.
Exactly.
Or 6 years later, rather, 6 years after Sports Gene. And I'm doing him one better. I'm going 7 years. That's connected to the second part of your question, which was what happened? How come it's not Endure 2? Which was part of it was I was wrestling a lot with that. What did I want to write about? I guess to backpedal, I've spent a long time thinking and writing about the science of endurance, and I still to this day find it a really fascinating topic. But Endure, I poured everything I had into Endure, and so the idea of writing Endure 2, Revenge of the Science of Endurance, it just wasn't exciting. It didn't seem fun to me because whatever new things I had to say within maybe 10 years from now, there's going to be revolutions, but whatever new things I had to say starting the day after Endure was published, they were going to be incremental. They were going to be small. And so I really was wrestling with this idea of from a business perspective, from a career perspective, doubling down on the success of Endure would have been the smart thing to do. but it just wasn't what I felt pulled to do. And so that in itself became the seed for the book. It's like, why do I want to do something new? And how does that parallel all the other aspects of life in which you want, even though I know I like the pad thai at my local Thai restaurant, why do I keep thinking I should try that weird soup that I can't pronounce? Like, why do I want to try new things? And so anyway, and that became and then I discovered that to write a book about a topic that's relatively new to you is really hard, and it takes a lot of research. And so here we are 7 years later.
And as you look at your career, I'm wondering if I've read in the past that people have a window. So people change jobs every 5 years. They start a new hobby every 7 years, whatever. Have you seen that? Because you made the huge shift from your PhD into journalism. Like, it turned out to be beautiful, but nobody saw that coming. You had to be thinking, I'm feeling this draw from my heart, but nobody's suggesting I do this. And have you seen any pattern in terms of spans of time?
So, I don't have a ton of data points in the career space, but, there's a cliche in the sports world of like, you've got 10 years of really high level training before you're kind of, whether it's your body or your mind or some combination of it. And I tend to think that's more about the mind than the body. Like, so people have this debate in the context of talent identification and early talent development. It's like, well, if you start your kid training at 9 years old, by 19, they're going to be that's where they're going to be fading out of the sport. And it's not because their legs are falling off. It's mostly because it's really hard to be fully single-mindedly engaged in something for year after year. I mean, it's really rewarding. Like I highly recommend being fully engaged in something, but there's this kind of 10-year frame that sort of pops up in different contexts, in the context of 10,000 hour rule type discussions too. I haven't really done the math on that in terms of whether that's, I spent roughly 10 years putting the bricks together for Endure. And then I was ready to shift to something different. Now, to fast forward a little bit, so the Explorer's Gene is coming out now, and it wasn't inconceivable to me when I started working on this book that by the time the book came out, I would not be writing my Sweat Science column, which is about the science of endurance, that I might have chosen to move on and do something else, whatever that may be. What I have found is, I'm doing it. It's nice to have a job, but I've also found that I'm enjoying it maybe more than I was for a little while after Endure came out, where it started to feel like a bit of a chore, that I was feeding the beast, and had to feed it on a more or less weekly basis. Sure. Now I'm finding that I'm kind of reinvigorated. Maybe some of the pressure is gone. I'm no longer trying to imagine or pretend that I am the world expert on the science of endurance. I mean, I was never trying to position myself as that, but when you're promoting a book on the science of endurance, sure, you kind of feel like you have,
and you had the platform. I mean, people look to you. Before I got to know you and know the kind of person you are, I still look to you as, his new article's out. I got to tap into this. So you were positioned with Outside and Runner's World prior to be that person, whether that was your goal or not.
Well, look, of course it was in some ways the goal. And especially once I started writing a book about the science of endurance, it was in my interests, whether I was conscious of it or not, to try and present myself as an expert. Now Endure has come and gone, and it's actually still here. Endure has come, and it's done well. I'm happy with it. I don't feel like I need to prove anything. So it's much easier for me to just write an article and this is what I know. And I don't know everything. Like I just wrote an article for Outside on carbohydrate intake during endurance sports.
Good timing.
And that is a hell of a controversial topic. Like everybody has opinions, and those opinions are very strong. They're almost tribal to some. So those are the kinds of topics that I was starting to dread writing about, because no matter what you write, someone is going to be like, well, you forgot this study from 2007 that found this, you moron. You're like, what is your problem? And that stuff rolls off a little easier now, because I'm a little more at peace with this. And so I guess the point I'm trying to circuitously make is, I wrote this new book on exploring, and maybe I imagined that the book was going to be subtitled "Why We Should All Explore More." In the course of writing it, I realized that it's a lot more nuanced than that. And really, I end up writing about this idea that's, fairly well known, of the explore-exploit dilemma, that, we're constantly making choices between sticking with what we know, with the path we're familiar with and where we know what the outcome is going to be, versus launching off into the unknown and trying something different. And I think there's a lot of rewards to exploring, which is a lot of what I write about. But that doesn't mean that exploiting is not also valuable. And in fact, always exploring and never exploiting is probably as bad, I'm putting that in scare quotes, as counterproductive as always exploiting and never exploring. Because if you're doing nothing but exploring, you're never enjoying the place where you got to. And this is something that I was really thinking hard about in the post-Endure time, when I was wondering what to do. It's like, man, I worked so hard to get here. Now am I going to say, well, I got here and I'm just going to walk away and not even enjoy the success of Endure and that position? So I think, but I still had this pull that I want to do something different. So I did something different, and I really spent 3 or 4 years digging into this idea of exploring and trying to understand the science of why we're drawn to new things and to uncertainty. And that's been fun. And I think that's a topic I'm going to continue following. But it had the benefit of also scratching that itch and saying, now I'm a little happier to exploit the stuff that I there's a reason I enjoy the science of endurance. It comes from my own life history as an endurance athlete. It leverages my interest in science. It brings together a lot of things that are good for me. And I find that I'm finding writing a column on the science of endurance much more rewarding now than I was 5 years ago. And I don't think I would have got there if I had just kept doing the same thing. I think by exploring, it helped me be more comfortable exploiting.
Is there anything, it seems like I remember you have young kids. Is that part of there's some more stability or consistency now with that? You've gotten out of the crazy cycle. Maybe I'm not putting words in your mouth. And so you feel, before you were literally on a treadmill, got to get the article in, but oh my gosh, the kids need me and blah, 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 blah. Has that stabilized to a point that allows you to now explore more, because the stability, almost the yin yang thing of, okay, you can't jump off when you don't have stability from which to jump?
Yeah. So having young kids has been a really important part of this journey in a lot of different ways. I think, so my kids are 8 and 11 now. Okay. So, subtract 7 years, they were, I guess like 1 and 3 or 2 and 4, I think, when the book came out. 1 and 3, they hadn't had their birthdays yet. So I think that experience of parenting young kids really informed my interest in exploring, because, as everyone who's been around young kids knows, like, there is nobody more exploratory than a young kid, and everything is new to them, which makes exploring so much more rewarding. And you can, as a parent, you kind of live vicariously through that. You're like,
you can see through their eyes.
Yeah. And you feel the same joy. You're like, I can't wait to go. It just snowed. I can't wait to go tobogganing because Natalie has never tobogganed before. That's going to be so much fun for me to see to see her face when she, goes down the slope and hits that tree for the first time, or whatever the case may be. So the path of my kids growing up has paralleled this book growing up in a lot of ways. And yeah, now they're just, I touch wood here, but they're reaching a stage where it's like, it's not the constant panic cycle. It's not, when I'm making plans, it's not like, oh man, I have to triple check that we have, full coverage for the kids before I arrange to do anything. Cause like, oh yeah, like if there's a gap or whatever, it's not such a big deal to arrange childcare now, or to have them hang out for an hour by themselves. So what does that mean for myself? It means I can start to feel a little more liberated to take some chances, try some new things. I mean, I think I mentioned this a little bit in the book of like, in my own explorations, there are different ways that I explore in life, right? And it's not just like, I don't go to the North Pole, so I'm not exploring in that way. But there have been times in my life where I do some fairly challenging backcountry stuff, and I still do that, but that's once a year, twice a year, maybe. So how am I exploring in my life? Maybe it's through my running. Am I trying new things? Am I facing new challenges, or am I just going back to doing the same training that I've always done and doing the same races that I've always done? What music am I listening to? Is it music is it the same album that I loved when I was 19 and that I know off by heart, or am I trying challenging new music? Because that takes some energy. It takes some, to engage with something new. Or books. Am I rereading my old favorite books, or am I reading, series that I know are easy? What I found while I was writing this book, and actually in Deer 2, I often found I couldn't engage with challenging books in the evening because I was so just mentally exhausted. Sure. And I found Inspector Maigret books. They're by George Simenon. They're short. He wrote like 90 of them, and I found, and they're all available online from my local library. So if I was tired, I would just be like, I must have read like 50 or 60 Maigret books over the course of that time. And the books were new to me. Like I wasn't rereading books, but they were not exploring. They were not challenging. I knew what I was going to get. And what sort of to actually answer your question or sort of answer your question, the kids were, in that sort of like 3 to 7 stage, I just found I just wanted to listen to the music I listened to when I was young. I wanted to run. I was just running 5K road races, like nothing challenging. Whereas before they were born, I'd been, experimenting with some like orienteering races, adventure races, things like that. So it's like you said, a yin and yang, different parts of life fit together, and you're getting that stimulus. In one part of your life, you don't need to seek it in another part of your life. But now the kid thing is settling down, and the book will be out shortly. By the time this episode airs, and so I'll be looking for the next adventure.
Well, and I think that's an important foundation to provide our listeners, because some of them are in places where they're like, I'm ready. This is so exciting. I want to dig into this. I'm totally feeling that pull. And other people are saying, oh, I have no energy to explore right now. So folks, that's not just fine. That's expected. We're going to go through different phases based on the other aspects of our lives, which will influence. It's almost like epigenetics. It's almost like it allows that explorer's gene to come to fruition during certain phases of life, when other phases, it's not time. It's not time. So I think that's it's good to hear the personal side of that. Let's kick off with the book itself. Set the stage of what is this whole concept of the explorer's gene. Give us the baseline of that.
Yeah, so it's a slightly provocative title. There are people in the world who hate seeing books titled The So-and-so Gene. And look, I consciously modeled the title on David Epstein's book, The Sports Gene. And I remember some conversations with him about how, he got a lot of pushback. It's like, there is no sports gene, you idiot. It's not just one gene. And if anyone who's read the book knows that he's clearly, saying that there is not one gene. But it's just to signal that he's talking about this idea of, what's innate and what's not. And so, what got me interested in this topic, actually, what sort of first put this on my radar? I think it was a 2012 article in National Geographic that talked about some research about a gene variant that affects a dopamine receptor, the DRD4 dopamine receptor. And some people become much more sensitive to novelty and risk and the rewards of discovering something new. And to, not to go too deep into this rabbit hole, but there's research showing that if you look at different populations around the world and you trace how far did they have to migrate in this sort of semi-recent past from where their ancestral homeland was to where they are now. So, some groups may have migrated from, Africa to Europe. Others made it all the way down to the southern tip of South America, which is a much longer migration path. You find that the farther a population group had to migrate, the more likely they are to have the DRD4 gene variant that is associated with a taste for novelty, a sort of yearning for the unknown, if you want to sort of make it more poetic. And that was fascinating to me. And I thought, like, wow, so, are we wired to seek out the unknown? And so that's where the title "The Explorer's Gene" comes from. And I think for anyone who reads the book, they'll come away with a more nuanced take.
Sure. No, absolutely.
We're not, it's not that some people are wired to explore and others aren't. And it's not that, this wiring is your destiny that forces you to do something. But the existence of these variations tells us that that all of us have, because we all have the same dopamine wiring. This gene variant just turns up the volume slightly or turns down the volume slightly in terms of how we respond to it. But all of us are wired to respond to the feeling of discovering something new, or to put it another way, of having a prediction error, of having our expectations violated. And the best way we can seek out prediction errors is to seek out the unknown, is to explore. Because if you're only doing what you already know, there's no prediction error. Everything is always as you expect. But if you take a chance,
the dark room problem, something like that.
Yeah. So there's an interesting sort of philosophical problem, which is that, okay, if you say we're wired to seek out uncertainty,
or certainty.
So the goal of seeking out uncertainty is to learn more about the world, because we want to be able to predict what's happening. That's why it's useful to us.
Expands
so if
knowledge.
we want to be able to predict what's happening with perfect certainty, then we should just lock ourselves in a dark room. And this is what, as you said, what's known as the dark room problem, because then we always know what's going to happen next. Nothing. And we should be happy because we're in a totally predictable environment. But actually it's clear that nobody enjoys being, under normal circumstances, being locked in a dark room. And so the sort of the way out of this problem is to say, we don't just want to know what's going to happen like right now or 1 second from now. We want to be able to predict into the future, so we know what's coming. And so to do that, we have to leave the dark room. We have to be drawn to figure out as much about the world as possible, to seek out. In order to have better predictions, we have to find the areas where our predictions are bad. We have to look for the unknown. And so that turns out, and there's various ways you can argue this in terms of neuroscience or biology or, genetics, but they all point to the same conclusion, which is that all else being equal, we have a sort of predisposition to want to find out what's behind the closed door or what's over the horizon that we don't know about.
And it seems like either your book or one of your articles was talking about, and if it's too constant, we break something. Or there's some theories about it's so extreme that if it's too straight line, we end up smashing something so that we have something else to figure out.
Yeah, well, so, you can seek out uncertainty or you can create uncertainty. You can, and that's, there's one set of theorists who say this is what play is. This is the purpose of play. Mm-hmm. It's that, exploring is going out and trying to find things that we don't know about. Playing is creating the rules of the game such that we can generate forms of uncertainty that feel good to satisfy. So if the world becomes too predictable, we find that just boring. And there's a curve that I describe in the book. It's hard to describe curves in audio form, but it's basically a bell curve kind of thing, and it's called the Wundt curve, or the Wundt curve, named after a Wilhelm Wundt, a German psychologist, which is this idea that how much we enjoy or appreciate or seek out an experience follows this upside down, this like bell curve based on how complex or how unknown or how unfamiliar it is. Where if it's very low uncertainty, if we already know everything about it, it's boring to us. But if it's too complex or too uncertain, then we also don't find that interesting because we can't make sense of it. We can't learn anything. It's like, if you give me a Dick and Jane book with like one word on each page, I'm not going to find that interesting because it's too simple to me. But if you give me a book in Norwegian, I'm also not going to find, even if it's a fantastic book, if I can't speak Norwegian, it's too uncertain or too unknown to me. And there's a sweet spot in the middle where it's like, it's just complicated enough to keep my interest, but not so complicated that it's, that I can't make sense of it. And so I think this idea of a want curve is useful because this curve is constantly shifting around and it's different for different people at different times. And so back to what we were talking about earlier about, what's going on when when you have young kids and life is full of chaos and your want curve is shifting down to where it's like, it doesn't take much for you to feel like, okay, that's enough uncertainty for me. That's enough challenge for me. I don't need any more in my life. At other times it's way out on the far that you're going to have to really push yourself to get to that sweet spot where you feel like you're learning enough.
And that tied into the words I quoted here, expanding the adjacent possible is part of that slope chasing. And the kind of the message that I was taking out of that, tell me if it's misinterpreted, is when I stretch at least a little bit along that Wundt curve, it opens up new pathways. Because if I'm learning a little bit of, in your example, Norwegian, now maybe I can understand a poem or some basics in Norwegian, and that becomes kind of interesting to me. Whereas before it was just didn't care at all. So is that part of the concept that we don't need to explore at the extreme? Exploring at the margins opens up additional doors, almost like the maps you talk about, them moving through different parts of the world. They had to explore the margins first, and then more margins, and then more margins. But we're doing that with our music, with our reading, with our political discussions, where we're actually listening instead of just stating our opinion, with our relationships we're building with new people. Is that along the right lines of what you're talking about there?
Yeah. So this idea of expanding the adjacent possible, it comes out of research that looks at like how people discover new music in Spotify, or how new pages on Wikipedia are created. And they find that most, the most likely music that you're going to listen to, for example, is something that has some connection to what you've listened to before. Yeah. It's going to be in a similar genre. It's going to be a similar artist or someone who has worked with that artist. There's going to be some links between there. And I think that's probably the dominant way of edging our way into new land, but it's not the only way. And I think it's important to contrast. So I kind of make the analogy between this sort of form of intellectual exploration and then, as you're saying, the geographical exploration. So and one of the things I talk about in the book is exploring the interior of Australia. And there were two famous expeditions that tried to cross the interior. And one of them was basically exploring the adjacent possible. And this was Sturt, who was just moving, like he did like 6 missions. He would go find the next water hole, come back, bring the whole camp, move it to the next water hole, camp there, explore the surroundings till he found another water hole. And so it took him 6 or 7 years of successive expeditions to gradually be moving across the continent. And then there was this other expedition, the Burke and Wills expedition. They were like, we're doing one expedition. And once they got halfway across, they were like, well, we can't really find any more water holes. It's like, let's just load up the camels with as much water we've got, and we'll go for it all the way across without. So that's the sort of giant leap philosophy. And Burke and Wills they were the first to cross the Australian continent. They also died before making it back. So it's a high risk, high reward philosophy. And so if you bring this back to the idea of intellectual exploration, I think expanding the adjacent possible is the most common and the smartest and the most effective way of gradually expanding your range. But if you look at, let's say, scientific papers or patents or other large data sets, of inventions and things, where do the big breakthroughs come from? They're from people who brought together regions that spanned a huge leap in one. So they, for instance, in scientific papers, one of the ways they can analyze this is, let's look at the references in the paper. Which journals did you cite? And usually it's like, if you're in the Journal of Physics, then you've cited the Journal of Applied Physics and the Journal of Theoretical
Very
Physics
narrow.
and the Journal of this physics and the Journal of that physics. And so all the combinations of journals you cited are very familiar, and other papers have cited the same combination of journals. Occasionally you have papers that are like, wow, this guy cited the Journal of Physics, but also cited the Journal of Linguistics and the Journal of, astronomical banana studies or whatever. Like, why things? And those papers that bring together broad fields, in other words, that kind of cross the continent in one bound, they're more likely to get ignored initially. They're more likely to kind of just drop off the map. But in the long term, they're way more likely to produce big breakthroughs that then change a field and change the direction of a field. So I guess I would say my message isn't necessarily expanding the adjacent possible is the only thing you should do. Sometimes you should be willing to take a big leap and try and it's maybe not a literal one where you die of thirst on the way back across the Australian desert, but metaphorically take some big chances, because they do have the potential of really creating something new. Whereas expanding the adjacent possible, we are expanding our horizons, and that's good, but you're unlikely to totally shock yourself with that. So, or to have a real epiphany. So I think we should aspire to have a mix of those two approaches, like that we're pushing back the boundaries, but sometimes we're willing to take our shot.
We're just going to be bouncing all over the place. I as I was reading this, I was curious if you've seen any skipping of generations. So Joe is a big time explorer. That's great grandpa. And as a result of that, his family lacks stability. And so they crave stability and they limit their exploration, which as a result creates great stability. So their children have that freedom to do a lot more exploring. Did you see any of that almost like bounce back and forth generationally because of the stability and lack thereof that was occurring in that generation?
That's an interesting point, and it makes a lot of intuitive sense. It's not something that I necessarily saw in the literature, except there is one finding that if you look at like how exploratory kids are, like toddlers, so before they've really absorbed, explicit messages about what they should be doing, like how far are they willing to wander away from mom and dad, and the presence of stability in their family life, like stable, consistent love, that has a big impact on how far away a toddler is willing to go. So I think that speaks to in part to what you're saying here, which is like, it's more likely you're going to be craving exploration if you have stability in at least parts of your life. And conversely, I think it's, I didn't see studies on this, but it's very, very easy to imagine that if you grew up being dragged across the frontier, by your exploring parents, that you might value the idea of putting down roots and just.
You could see it either way. You could see it being like, oh yeah, that's the way you're supposed to live life. And you've got that model. And by the same token, it's like, oh my gosh, my childhood was a disaster because dad wanted to do all this crazy stuff. I'm not living that life. I could see it going both ways.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So I think about this a lot in the context of my own kids, obviously. For my wife and I, backcountry adventure is a big part of our life. It's a big part of how we, met and it's
your first chapter.
So, yeah. This is what we wrestle with, because we still, obviously we don't want to drag our kids on pure sufferfest. They didn't choose any of that. But on the other hand, this is what we do. This is what we enjoy doing. And so on the one hand, we're wrestling with how much is too much for, a 6-year-old kid, for example. On the other hand, one of the things I wonder about is, paradoxically, are we kind of making this world less interesting, this aspect of the world less interesting for our kids? Because I know for me, I didn't grow up doing backcountry stuff. And so my first real backcountry trip was, I think I was 15, and a couple of friends from school suggested going on a canoe trip and in Algonquin Park. And, I didn't know anything about it. And I could tell an hour's worth of stories about what a complete disaster it was amazing, but like, it's amazing we survived because we didn't know a whole lot about how to handle these trips. But so there was a sense of personal discovery for me. Sure. Like I was discovering this world that I'm out there. I think my parents would never believe that I'm standing here like with a canoe on my head, stuck in a tree, and a moose 2 feet in front of me, and like all this crazy stuff that I went through on this very first trip. And so my kids will be like, yeah, we were going on canoe trips when we were 2, and we were going backcountry, hiking in the Rockies when we were 4. So on the one hand, they'll be comfortable with it. On the other hand, maybe it's just boring for them. Maybe their exploration will have to be something completely different that's new to them.
Or maybe the introduction sparks. It's impossible to guess. Our daughter, who's 28 now, the other day said, and she's a big runner now. Our family does a lot of like boulder and that kind of thing. And she just made the humorous comment that, Dad, it seems like 5Ks were way more fun than they should have been when we were little kids. Because we get up and it was like, it's race day, everybody. And we'd go, then we'd do the race, and then they'd usually win some awards, so we'd go out and celebrate. And so, but she was just processing like, it's not really that fun for a kid to go run 3.1 miles, but they were really fun. And it seems like that doesn't fit. So maybe you're doing the same thing with your kids.
That's our genuine hope.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Let's pop back to dopamine, because everybody's talking about dopamine in their opinion. You talked about the DRD4 gene variant ties into maybe the way that is expressed. What are we missing from what you've seen? And I know there aren't answers yet with this, but what are we missing in our desire to simplify a much bigger picture about dopamine? Social influencers, in quote, are wanting to use this word to get clicks and that kind of thing. But what are people missing when it comes to this concept of dopamine that you came across in this process?
Yeah, dopamine is, I'll be brutally honest and say, I had hoped that one of the things this book could do was kind of clean up the mess and say, all right, look, here's what dopamine is, here's what it isn't. Unfortunately, and I wish I could sell a better picture of the book, but unfortunately it doesn't do that, because dopamine, it's like, I just could not get, there isn't a straightforward answer yet, because there are conflicting theories about what dopamine does. I mean, we know that it acts as a neurochemical, that a neuromodulator. And so on the microscopic level, we can say, yeah, dopamine assists or blocks this transmission of this kind of nerve. But what is its purpose? What is it for? And that's where where it gets complicated. There's a couple of points that I think are worth understanding. So that's the caveat, saying that I don't have a grand theory of dopamine. I could not get one, but a couple of things that I came away with. One is dopamine is not the pleasure chemical. Dopamine, we don't, like, when we talk about, I was pursuing that, I needed my dopamine hit, which is why I, surfing TikTok or was smoking meth or whatever the case may be. I don't know. Do you smoke meth? I don't even know anything, but whatever.
It's good that you don't know. I'm glad to know.
Yeah. Dopamine isn't about pleasure. Dopamine is about wanting. And there's some really fascinating studies from about 30 years ago looking at rats and, disabling their dopamine receptors and finding that it's not that they stopped liking sugar water, it's they stopped wanting it. So they're totally uninterested in it, but you put it in their mouth and they're still just as happy. They still like it just as much. So this distinction between liking and wanting. Liking is like endocannabinoids and endorphins, the sort of body's equivalent of marijuana and morphine. Dopamine is about wanting. It's about the drive to do something. And that's why it's so tied to exploring, that it's not about what you have, it's about what you would like to have, and that feeling of anticipation, which, when you stop and think about it, is really often a lot more fun than the feeling of feeling of wanting something is a lot more fun than the feeling of having something. And that's something running has taught me a lot too. It's Absolutely. Like you dream for 10 years of running a certain time or running a certain race. And it's great.
As soon as you do it,
then it's like, all right, what's next? I need to be on that quest again, which I think is really intimately tied to the idea of exploring, and why we're drawn to the unknown is because that's a dopamine mediated thing. Now, there are other ways of understanding dopamine which have to do with the prediction error. One way of understanding dopamine is that it fires when you have a positive prediction error, when something is better than you expect. So you get a hit of dopamine, not when something is good, but when something's better than you expect. So, and this is, you can understand, for example, drug addiction in this way. It's like, you take a drug and you get this feeling and it's, wow, this is better than I expected. And so you get a hit of dopamine and that makes you want to do it again. But that's the first time you take it. The 10th time you take it, you get this feeling, and you've already had it 10 times, so you know exactly what the feeling you're going to get is. So you don't get that dopamine hit anymore because there's no prediction error. You knew exactly what to expect. And so then you have, leads to a cycle of addiction, because then you're like, well, I need to take a higher dose in order to get a better than expected result. You're constantly chasing something that's better than you expect. So that's a very damaging cycle, whether you're talking about TikTok or drugs. But it's also what underlies exploration, because what is the best way of getting a prediction error? What is the best way of getting something that's better than you expect? It's to do something where you don't know what the outcome is. Because if you know what the outcome is, you're not going to get a prediction error. It's only by taking a chance, by, veering off into the unknown, that you give yourself a chance of getting that positive prediction error, which will in turn give you the hit of dopamine. So those are the idea of it's a prediction error. You get dopamine when something's better than you expect, and that it's about wanting, not about having or liking. Those are the two things that I think are important to take away from dopamine. Now, all the stuff about like dopamine fasting and are we addicted to dopamine, that's an interesting discussion. I think it's probably fair to say that dopamine has, in that context, becomes not a neurochemical, but just kind of a blanket word to refer to this whole idea of reward behavior, of getting a reward for doing something. And sometimes we get that reward too easily and we get hit for the reward. Dopamine is probably not the best descriptor from that, but as long as you don't get too hung up on the neuroscience, you can sort of understand that people are using it in a hand-waving way.
You talked a little bit about this, but hot streaks. So whether artists, scientists, et cetera, wide exploration followed by dramatic narrowing of focus is what produced the magic. So explore, then exploit what you've discovered. It's not one or the other, and you've touched on that. Are there clues to the tipping point? Is there a sweet spot? Is there clues that people can be looking for in their own life of their own exploration? So and I know there's not an answer, but are there clues of where you go, I think maybe I'm at a exploit point right now?
Yeah, that's a the $1 million question. Yeah. I mean, just to back up a little bit before answering that, I think this idea of hot streaks is really interesting. This idea that we tend to, in any career, there tends to be periods where we're producing our best work, and it's interestingly, it's not necessarily always when you're young or always when you're middle-aged or always when you're old. It can happen anytime. And there's been this great big data analysis of career trajectories in artists and scientists and movie directors by a guy named Dashan Wang at Northwestern, who has tried to figure out what predicts a hot streak. And as you were saying, he finds it's not just exploring, it's not just exploiting, it's the combination of exploring then exploiting. And I think this really it kind of dovetails nicely with some of the ideas in David Epstein's book, Range. I keep referencing David, but he's done some really great work in this area.
He was a guest previously, and that was one of my favorites. Range is a fantastic book, folks.
Yeah. And one of the things he gets into is that it's like, if you want to be really successful in something, or you find something good, I mean, before you put in 10,000 hours of effort, you got to make sure you're focused on the right thing, the thing that fits your specific talents, the thing that fits the moment that the world needs at this moment. And the best way to do that is not necessarily just to decide, all right, this is what I'm going to become a master in. It's to figure out what you're good at, figure out what works, what other people respond to. And that requires exploring. Now, if you just spend all your time exploring, looking for the greatest idea, and never actually start something. And, let's be honest, we all know people who follow this path, and we all probably recognize it in ourselves sometimes, that we get stuck in that loop of looking for the perfect option and never quite pulling the trigger. But you're never going to do anything if you don't start exploiting. So when do you make that transition? Look, it depends on the context a little bit, but one of the pieces of advice that I found useful was from a guy named Mark Malmdorf Anderson, who's a cognitive scientist in Denmark, who's done a lot of work on the idea of play. And so this, I'm sort of transposing his remarks on play into the context of your question. And he is a big believer in trusting your own sense of curiosity and interest to indicate where there's an opportunity, a rich opportunity to, reduce uncertainty, to learn more about the world. So like I was asking him questions about like, should adults play more? Like how do we help kids play better or whatever? And he's like, the whole point of play is that it's an intrinsically motivated activity, that you do it because it's fun. And that sense of fun, that sense of that you're interested or curious about something, is your brain's signal that it has found an area in the sweet spot of that Wundt curve, where it's like, this is a right level of uncertainty for us. There's something to learn, but it's not too simple. It's not too complicated. So I realize that's kind of wishy-washy advice, but yeah, if you're exploring career options, or you're exploring strategic options for your business, or you're exploring romantic options and relationships, there's no formula, right? Like there are formulas, but they're not realistic. You can't, really, I think the key is, and this won't always be a magic solution, but the key is to really try and give yourself space, give yourself time to tune into what you're feeling, to tune into what's interesting to you. And maybe an example of this, I guess, this is not 100% related, but in 2017, I was a columnist at Runner's World. And then I had a call from Outside Magazine in 2012, but before
Endure. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was at Runner's World from 2012 to 2017, and then I moved to Outside. But in 2012, when I first moved to Runner's World, I also had an offer from Outside Magazine to be a columnist there. And so I was weighing between Runner's World and Outside Magazine. And I was really torn because I thought Outside was, with no disrespect intended to anyone, it was a little more literary, a little more kind of high class. But Runner's World, like, I was a runner. I'd been, I'd read every issue of Runner's World in the 90s. And so I was torn between two things which both had value. And I was really, really torn. And eventually I made the decision to go with Outside. And I accepted, and I told Runner's World that I wasn't going to accept their offer. And then, I went and I remember I was on vacation with my family, and I went back to the table and we sat down to have dinner, and I realized I was crying. I was like, there were tears running down my cheeks. And I was like, I think that's a sign that what I really wanted to do was go to Runner's World. And it's like, I couldn't intellectualize it. I couldn't sort through, there was no list of pros and cons that could tell me what to do. But once I had made the decision, I realized that it wasn't deep down what I wanted to do. And so I called back, and this was half an hour later, and everyone was super nice about it. And, I didn't burn too many bridges with Outside, because they welcomed me back 5 years later. But that's the kind of because when you say just do what feels right, it sounds so obvious, but it's a lot harder than it's, at least for a lot of people. For me, certainly, it's very hard to tune into what you're actually feeling. And sometimes it takes some extra effort or some time to realize when your mind on some level is telling you this is the right choice. This is where you're going to have the most rewarding path.
It's such a great story. It reminds me of the coin flip trick, where they say when you've got those two and you just can't decide, you flip a coin. This is heads is for this one, tails for this one. and then you see what does your heart say when you get the answer.
Are you happy or sad?
Exactly. When you're like, oh, bummer, it's tails. Oh, that means Runner's World. So that's
exactly
really cool.
it.
Love that. How much does deciding to explore play a role in the growth and expansion? Simple example that actually rolls right into your book about music. I had a small collection of vinyls, and as I was looking over them 18 months ago or so, I realized it's pretty much exactly what you said in the book. It's artists from my teens and early 20s. And so what I did about 18 months ago is I downloaded the Rolling Stones top 100 albums of all time, and then just went looking at used books or used record stores and would buy them regardless of what I thought. So I ended up with albums that I never in my wildest dreams, my kids were giving me a hard time about some of them, super stretching it, but it's been awesome. My music, my love for music as a whole has grown. My love of new forms of music has grown. It's been fantastic. But there was that moment when I said, I'm going to download this list and we're going to buy basically sight unseen. I have no idea who this artist is, but it's on the list, so we're buying it. Is there something about that deciding moment that is required to move you into that exploration?
So I think sometimes, I think not always. Let me start by saying I have a very similar story, which was that I grew up as a jazz saxophone player.
Your Bird album story was fantastic. I'm like, totally, that's exactly, Alex.
But I had super narrow musical interests. So I was oblivious to the popular music of my generation or generations before, for better or worse. It was just the way, the way that's who I was. And at a certain point in my mid 20s, I was postdocing in the States, and to a point we were talking about earlier in the conversation, I was just working in physics and I was running my ass off. So my world, and I didn't have people to play my sax with. My world was kind of a little narrower. So I had more intellectual bandwidth for exploration. Mm-hmm. And I thought, like 6 billion people can't be wrong. I bet some of this other music is pretty good. And I guess the other thing that had happened was, for the first time in my life, because I had moved to the States and I'd never owned a car in my life, but I was living in suburban Maryland, you need a car. So I had a car, I was driving places. And so I had turned the radio on. So I was listening to the music on the radio, which I had never done before. Like in my house, the radio was always on CBC, which is the Canadian sort of news network. And so I was hearing lots of like public affairs programming, but I wasn't hearing pop music. So I was listening to this music and some of it was like, hey, this is actually pretty good. So I went into the lab where I was working and I was like, okay, guys, I've decided I'm going to join BMG Record Club, which was a thing back in the day.
Totally. 1 penny, baby.
They're going to give me 12 albums for a penny. And then I only have to buy like 6 more or something like that. But I don't know what I should buy. I have no idea what music is about. So I'm going to take a poll. I went around to everyone in the labs like, okay, I've just been dropped from Mars. I don't know anything about the best music of the last 50 years. Tell me what albums I should get. And people, so I got some super obvious ones. I got like a double album of the Beatles and their greatest hits. I got a double album of the Rolling Stones. Sure. But I also got some, a lot of more obscure stuff. I remember my boss saying, like Fleetwood Mac, they're underappreciated. They're and I was getting like Stevie Wonder and I was getting Madonna. I was getting ABBA, like basic stuff, right? Like these are not deep cuts.
You're reading the Rolling Stones list from me.
Yeah. But so I got this stuff and it's like, and some of it I've rarely listened to since then. Others, it's like, this is some of my favorite songs. But that was a deliberate act of exploration. This wasn't just a case of like,
you didn't fall into it.
I'm feeling, Right. And so I think, I guess earlier I was saying, you got to follow your nose. You got to see what's interesting to you, but you can't follow. If you're living in a walled city, you have no idea what's outside those walls unless you deliberately leave those walls. And so sometimes in order to explore, you need to take an action that's going to expose you to what's new. And then you can decide among those options, what's interesting to me and what's not. But we definitely in our society, we're very goal focused. We're working on our career. We're bringing up family. We're doing all these things. And so it's easy to just put the blinders on and not be aware of what's out there. And so taking that action, the Rolling Stone 100 list or whatever it is, even if you hate 99 of the albums, which I'm sure you won't, like this gives you, it's a way of exploring and finding new things that wouldn't have just happened just by sort of moseying along and seeing what's already in front of your nose. So I think that's both a great tactic and a great kind of metaphor for how to think about exploration, and the role it can play and how you can enact it in your own life.
Well, I think it can be applied anywhere. I remember Tom Peters. I don't know if you're a Tom Peters fan, but he used to write about when you're on a business trip, go grab a magazine of a topic at the airport that you would never read. So if you're not a gardener and you've never picked up a shovel, fine, grab a gardening magazine, because that will open your eyes to other things that always reading Forbes or Fortune or Wall Street Journal never would have gotten you into. So I think it can apply to all of these things. Try a new Netflix thing that doesn't come up as part of your algorithm. Listen to the music, grab the book, have coffee with someone that you are like, I think they're kind of crazy, but let's have coffee. So it seems like it can be applied in any aspect of life.
Yeah. And I think, you're touching on there one of the big dilemmas of modern life, which is the rise of the algorithm. Yeah. That's, and so, as you were saying, like, oh yeah, you pick up an article about gardening. And I was thinking, when I open my web browser, I think it's Pocket or something, like it just came automatically with Firefox, and it's always suggesting, it's got a grid of, 8 articles that pop up unbidden in front of me. And it's actually, the algorithm is very good. It has learned the kinds of things I find interesting. And I'll be like, oh, yeah, 4 of those articles are actually really intriguing. I'd like to read those. And that's great. Like, so, the algorithms can be useful and smart, but there's a danger then that you will only ever expand the adjacent possible. You'll learn stuff that's very similar to what you already know, and you won't have a chance to make the bigger leaps to discover something genuinely new to you. So it's, I'm not the first to say this, that the rise of the algorithm is a worrying thing for exploration, is intellectual exploration, for taking an active role in discovering what might be interesting to you, instead of just having stuff steered your way.
I mentioned Alex is one of my favorite writers, but as you can tell, he's just a good guy too. I remember getting out for a run together a few years ago when he came through Colorado. Ridiculously smart, but so down to earth and real. I hope you got a sense of that during this discussion. And speaking of discussions, part 2 of this interview picks up in the next episode. So we'll see you on the other side. Thanks for tuning in to the #1 podcast for health and wellness coaching, and thank you so much for sharing it with others. We exist for you, and we grow because of you. So thank you. As always, feel free to reach out to us with any questions about your current or future coaching career, results at catalystcoachinginstitute.com, or tap into additional health, wellness, and performance resources at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. And now, it's time to be a catalyst. This is Dr. Brad Cooper of Catalyst Coaching. I will speak with you soon on another episode of the Coaching Lab podcast, or maybe over on the YouTube coaching channel.